Okay. So actually, I should have just left us going, but just to reiterate where we are again, just to remind those who are just catching up on the video, what we saw is we have the details page is bound to the active employee. So the problem is that any changes made here immediately get saved or persisted back to the database. We don't have a choice to save or cancel, make that decision ourselves, and so on and so forth. So we discussed it instead of the code as we see here, basically just grabbing the active employee from our app object and setting that as the data context for our grid. What we really want to do is create our own copy of what an employee is. That's not part of the actual data context of linked to SQL, right? It's like a clone, you might say, but it's detached. Now we will implement one of those two properties, just the property changed event or interface, so that it can know that it has changed from when it was first created, right? But it is not directly capable of persisting its changes back. So really, ideally then our view model object will be like a clone, so that means it's going to have more or less all the same properties, right, that our actual employee has. By the way, not all view models are clones of existing model objects, right? We tend to do that as the first kind of view model we might need, but there are times when we might want to put together a collection of information that's summary information, pulling out of the database with some aggregate functions and so on, and present that easily in a view. So we'll make a view model object, right? So we can just load it with its data, pass it off to a page, and you can bind to it and then just show all the data that's in that particular object. So they aren't always the same as a model. I'm just trying to drive that point home. Now, for organization, I could put view models in the same folder as I have my models right now, but typically what most developers do is they create a separate, just to segregate them, organize them a little bit. I'll make a separate folder and I'll just call it view models. So I will add a folder, call it view models, and in here I will add a class then. So it's going to be, as I said, more or less a clone of the employee. So I might as well call it employee view model. Just make sure I view. That's good enough. Employee view. Okay. So there's a fair bit of code because we already have quite a few properties for an employee model object, and we're going to be matching every one of those with a property inside here. It's fairly big. Let me just grab my code, get it in place, then we'll talk about it. Okay, now obviously a few usings we need, right? So I'll use my control period, get system component model. Another thing is there's references down here further to department, right? Our department model class. But of course now we're working in a separate directory or folder, so I just have to add a using for that, right? So that'll be a simple one. Just using my projects models folder. So now it knows about the models that are there. Okay, so just going back to the top for a second. As I said, we're going to implement iNotify property change just so the object itself can know that it's changed its values since it was first created, right? We just have a simple getter on the ID. Okay, we don't need the user interface to ever change the primary key, so a getter is fine. And then we see the same pattern here repeated for each of the actual data properties. So they, as I said, as a clone, they pretty much match the data types and everything else of the actual employee, right? They're a little bit cleaner and simpler because we only have the one interface to implement here for the after event for changing properties, but the same thing over and over again for each one all the way down through. Same with the foreign key stuff here. We have our employee department, okay, and so on. All right, now here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. The view model itself, in order to be an effective clone, it has to know how to complete the cloning process, right? No, we're not writing a zombie movie script here or anything like that, but you know, we do need to be able to load data into the object and then get the data back out, so we can decide if hey, I want to save these changes, right? And so on. So we usually do that with this kind of an arrangement where we will add, I kind of lost my spot here. I think you can see that still from the back of the room. Okay, so we'll simply add a load and a save, okay, as methods to the object. In both cases, we pass in the same thing, an actual employee, right? The active employee is what we're going to use, okay, in the system. So to load this clone or this view model of an employee, we pass in the actual employee we want to edit, right, as an object. And all our code is it takes all the values from that employee object and saves them into its private variables, right? That's all the load really has to do. Now when it goes to save, so if we decide to call the save method of this view model object, we just pass in again the employee that we want to update, right? The one that's actually data bound to the data context of our link to SQL, and it just reverses the assignments, right? So it takes all the values out of the private variables inside of itself and assigns them to the properties of the object we've passed in. And that's all it takes to save. But now we have a separate object that we can call, okay, these methods when we need to either fill it with data initially or to save the data and update the employee. And that's just the general delegate there to handle all the property change stuff. So it looks like a lot of code, but most of it's just coming from the fact there's a lot of properties on my employee. It's really just this is kind of the new concept. So the view model knows how to load data into itself and save data back out if we give it a real model, so to speak, to save it to. And of course we know how this works though. Once it actually saves all the changes to the properties of a real employee that's data bound, then it just persists its own changes back to the database. Okay, now in order to use this, I am going to make a few changes in the actual page itself. Right now, just for simplicity, I only created the first few controls. So something else we want to do is come down here and add the other controls we need for the rest of the bound fields. So I do have that, kind of skipped over that, sorry, in my my help file here. Okay, so we're going to add this code under the last text box here. So what have we really put in? Well, as you can see, really, as shown over here in the designer, we just have for the department, the start date and the salary, right? But we're utilizing some of the controls that came from our tool set. Okay, so again, we're using that same list picker control that we had on the main page that allowed us to select a department to filter and see employees by. But we can use the same control nicely to give us the ability to assign or possibly reassign, right, the department to an employee. Other one that's new to us now is the date picker. Okay, date picker is a kind of sophisticated little control. It's a very standard approach that Windows Phone uses whenever you want to set a date, right? Comes up with a little black, well, depending on your theme and so on, but a more or less blank page with boxes. Well, you'll see it in a moment where you have day, month, year, and you can just flick and then scroll through all the different choices and combine them to make the date you want. Now, it actually dynamically creates its own page. I'm mentioning that now because it comes up in code in a little while that we don't actually see a new page in our Solution Explorer, But whenever we use this, it dynamically creates a page just to show this control on. Okay? And then when we're finished using it,